Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today we're continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, over the course of the last several days, especially in the Western mainstream media, all the ballyhoo, all the talk, all the discussion is about, or was about, the Ukrainian / NATO attack against Russian air bases deep inside the Russian Federation. And as we have talked about before, that messaging contends that anywhere between 30 and 40% of the Russian strategic aviation was destroyed by this intelligence-based attack. Now, let's harken back to World War II. Let's look at Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a significant attack against the United States by the Empire of Japan. And then a few years later, what happened? Well, Pearl Harbor started the conflict, and then ultimately U.S. military power in the form of nuclear weapons ended the conflict. Now, recently, there has been a debrief by the Austrian General Staff Training Academy that really goes in deep in terms of what is happening in the conflict. Now, if you're watching the conflict and you're paying close attention to what's happening, this attack against Russian strategic aviation is something that is not going to change the outcome of the war. More importantly, there have been new Russian offensive operations that have started over the last several days that is breaking down the Ukrainian military. These operations, in all probability, by the Russians, are more important in terms of ultimate outcomes than the Ukrainian strike against those strategic air bases. If you look and you pay close attention to these cauldrons that are being formed by the Russians, and then these cauldrons are then collapsing. Look up here near Pokrovsk. Let's back up a few days. And look at this area here. And then let's go forward. Again, continual collapsing of those pockets that the Russians first envelop, isolate, and then destroy those Ukrainian units. At the same time, you also have to look at the situation within the Ukrainian military, its recruitment efforts, its ability to continue to field an effective fighting force along the front lines. And we've talked about before about the predicament of the average Ukrainian soldier on those front lines. He is much older than the average Russian soldier. He is much less equipped and supplied than the average Russian soldier. His esprit de corps, his morale, is much less than the average Russian soldier. Now look, this is not this channel being biased. It is simply the fact. Now, that those facts in terms of what is happening with these cauldrons, these collapsing cauldrons and the destruction of the Ukrainian military on the ground, at least if you're in the West and you're watching updates, you tend to think that for some reason the Ukrainians may have an advantage based on the last example of the Ukrainian strike against those Russian strategic bombers. But the reality is, those strikes by the Ukrainians against those strategic bombers are going to have a marginal effect on the ultimate outcome of the war. And then we're also seeing at the same time more aggressive operations by the Russians taking place in other sectors, such in this case towards Sumy, a new Russian operation designed to draw Ukrainian manpower, designed to draw NATO assets towards this sector, and then ultimately we will probably see new offensive operations in other sectors by Russian forces. And again, these cauldrons, there's a reason the battlefield is shaping. There's a reason the battlefield looks the way it does. Cauldrons and salients, encirclement operations. In some cases, small-scale unit operations. But this is the strategy right now that Russia believes is going to win the conflict. Now, what is that going to look like? Is it going to be an end through negotiations? Or is there a possibility that there are additional rear area operations by the Russians that sow chaos and then eventually cause the rapid onset of a Ukrainian military collapse? That is highly likely. Now the question is what is that going to look like, and what is going to be the response by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and also the United States? What is going to be the messaging by the mainstream media in the West to a possible collapse of the Zelensky regime? What's going to happen? Now look, you have to call it, I get it. Some people filch at me stating the Zelensky regime. But look, let's face it. There's been no elections in the Ukraine, and Zelensky has essentially an unconstitutional grip on power that I would argue exceeds the grip on power that Vladimir Putin has in the Russian Federation. It's almost like, well, it is essentially the pot calling the kettle black. And in this case, the pot, meaning Zelensky, may be much darker than the kettle in the Russian Federation. It's interesting to see what is happening in the Ukraine in terms of what is happening. And a lot of times the reporting is just not getting out to what is happening in the Ukraine. There is a reason a lot of these content providers that were at one point existing in the Ukraine have fled the Ukraine. There's a reason for that. But again, more importantly, is ultimately the battlefield. The current shape and status of the Ukrainian army, the ground forces, and its ability to continue to supply its forces in the field. We are going to reach a stage where the Russians are going to be using up to 500 kamikaze drones per day against Ukrainian forces. The United States and Western European powers cannot provide an air defense capacity that is going to prevent those strikes from happening. And it's going to be incredibly cost prohibitive for the United States and European powers to provide those very advanced air defense systems that have the ability to take down those kamikaze drones. And those kamikaze drones are indeed having an effect. Even if 100 drones are launched and 80 of them are either destroyed, brought down by electronic warfare or kinetic operations, those 20 drones do strike aim points. And the Russians conduct follow-on strikes with ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. Again, very difficult for the Ukrainians to intercept those systems. Let's go back here and just kind of back up and look at what has happened over the last several weeks. And this sector here to the northeast of Pokrovsk is a great example of this Russian strategy. Again, what happened in this sector here, in the collapse of these pockets, you have micro pockets and then you have the main pocket, is more significant than what the Ukrainian operation did to Russian strategic aviation. There was very little loss of, I would say, effective material and, more importantly, manpower. Whereas in this operation, here, again, a lot more deadlier for Ukrainian forces. And these operations are going to continue. They're going to pick up momentum as we enter the summer months. And then we suspect that due to the massive amounts of reserve forces that the Russians now possess, that those reserve forces are going to become operational against Ukrainian forces. And not only that, compounding that, again, as we just talked about, the increase in those drone and missile attacks as the Russians ramp up production of those systems, and the Ukrainians have less and less capability to shoot those systems down, is eventually just going to completely wear the Ukrainian military down. And then ultimately, a general collapse of the Ukrainian force construct in the theater of operations. And again, what is going to be the response of Western Europe and the United States when this chaos sets in? And chaos eventually will set in terms of both the Ukrainian government and its ability in terms of the Ukrainian military. It's going to happen. Well, look, it was great having this discussion today. As always, thank you for joining us. More to come very, very soon. Good day.